Bullets tear through the ridge. 6 Navy SEALs trapped, seconds from annihilation. Their radios scream for air support, but help is 20 minutes away. They won't last too. Then, crack, one shot, another. Fighters drop before they even know where death is coming from. The SEALs break free, but their savior isn't who you think. She's too small, they mocked. She'll wash out in days. Yet Julia Kane, a woman half the size of her classmates, survived the world's most brutal sniper school and delivered the impossible shot that saved America's elite warriors. How does someone everyone doubted become the sniper nobody can forget? That's the story you're about to witness. Comment where you're watching from, hit subscribe to VeteranBiker, and let's dive into the mission that turned disbelief into legend. Gunfire shredded the mountain air. The echo rolled off sheer stone walls, bouncing back in a deafening chorus that swallowed even the shouts of men pressed against the jagged ridge. 6 SEALs, pinned flat behind boulders no bigger than dining tables, fought for breath as shards of stone sprayed from impacts inches above their helmets. Every direction burned with muzzle flashes. The enemy had them triangulated, cutting off retreat and hammering the slope with relentless bursts. Lieutenant Mark Richards spat grit from his mouth, pressed his radio to his lips, and roared above the storm of lead. "Command, this is Eagle 6. We're pinned. Multiple hostiles requesting immediate support." Static swallowed the reply. Then a calm voice. "Nearest cover aircraft 20 minutes out." "Hold position 20 minutes." Richards glanced at his men, faces blackened with dust, eyes locked with the same grim calculation. They would not survive too. The youngest of the squad, Petty Officer Green, nudged his commander with a trembling hand. "Sir, movement on the East Ridge. They're flanking." Richards snapped his head toward the outcropping. Figures scrambled upward, dark shapes moving fast against the pale rock, rifles slung, closing on the high ground that overlooked the SEALs' last refuge. If they reached that ledge, every man on the ridge would be slaughtered. He cursed under his breath, weighing impossible odds. If they take that point... The thought never finished. Crack! One of the climbing fighters jerked violently, sliding limp down the slope. Another report, sharper, slicing through the cacophony of automatic fire. A second man pitched backward, rifle spinning out of his grasp. A third burst of sound, clean, surgical, and the last climber collapsed in a heap. The enemy erupted in shouts. The barrage faltered. Then more sharp cracks rolled in, deliberate and unhurried, each punctuated by a body tumbling into the dust. Whoever was firing was unseen, yet their bullets carved with uncanny precision through the chaos. "Who the hell?" Green whispered, eyes wide behind his goggles. "Doesn't matter," Richards barked. "Keep your heads down. Use the window." But before he could rally his team, their radios sparked again, this time a new voice. "Eagle 6, this is Phantom Sight. Northern exit is clear. You have 60 seconds. Move." The tone was steady, clipped, detached from the storm of violence. No call sign Richards recognized, no known unit nearby. He hesitated, doubt fighting instinct, yet the evidence was right there, their attackers dropping one after another, halted by an invisible guardian. He made his choice. You heard her. We move. Now. The squad broke cover, sprinting into the open, boots pounding loose shale. Bullets followed, chewing through dust and stone, but covering fire from the unseen sniper kept heads ducked. Men fell prone, crawled, then pushed back to their feet, lungs burning. Richards risked a glance up the cliff face as he ran. For a split second, he caught the faintest movement, a small figure pressed against rock, camouflaged cloth blending into the slope. The shooter slid down a scree shelf, narrowly avoiding the gaze of an enemy patrol that swept flashlights across the incline. she, because Richard swore the silhouette was slender, lighter than any man he'd seen in the field, reset her weapon, lined another shot, and squeezed off 2 rounds. Both targets crumpled before they could even locate her. The seals burst through a gap in the kill zone, staggering into a ravine where the terrain shielded them from gunfire. Hearts hammered, adrenaline surging, they clustered in cover, gasping at the miracle they hadn't expected. Richards grabbed his handset. "Phantom sight, whoever you are, we owe you." Silence stretched. Then the same composed voice answered, softer this time. "Just doing my job, Commander. Phantom sight out. The channel went dead." Richards stared at the radio as if it might yield a face, but the mountain had already swallowed the ghost who saved them. High above, Julia Kane exhaled slowly, chest pressed against cold stone. Her rifle lay steady across a folded sling, barrel cooling after the last volley. She wiped a trickle of sweat from her temple with the back of her glove, careful not to break her camouflage. Loose rock crunched beneath her knee, threatening to betray her position. She froze, waiting until the searchlights swept past. The enemy would be hunting now. They had to know a sniper was out here. She slid sideways into shadow, hugging the ground, every muscle taut with the strain of staying invisible. Her mind calculated distances, wind shifts, angles of exposure. Each move meant risk, each delay a chance for her prey to turn predator. A shout echoed below. Boots clattered against rock. She rolled into a shallow depression, pressed her face into the earth, and steadied her breath. The patrol passed within yards, rifles raised, eyes scouring the slope. She didn't blink. Only when their footsteps faded did she lift her head, slowly, inch by inch. The valley stretched beneath her, eerily quiet now that the seals had escaped. Smoke drifted in thin ribbons across the ravine. The bodies she'd claimed with her rifle lay still, dark stains spreading across the dust. It wasn't triumph she felt, it was the familiar weight of necessity. Julia Kane had trained for this moment long before anyone believed she belonged. The mountains had become her proving ground, and tonight she had turned disbelief into survival. But the mission wasn't finished. She gathered her gear with practiced hands, breaking down her position. The rifle disappeared into its case, scope capped, sling wound tight. She slung the pack across her shoulders, every motion economical, silent. One last glance toward the ridge. No witnesses, no name etched into the rock, only the whisper of a legend beginning. Then she vanished into the mountainside, leaving behind nothing but questions and the echo of a call sign, phantom sight. The Mediterranean sun poured down on the asphalt of the parade ground, bleaching the surface to a glare that made eyes sting. 25 candidates stood in rigid formation, boots aligned, uniforms pressed sharp, rifles slung against shoulders. All except one looked like they belonged. Broad-shouldered Marines, sinewy sailors, men hardened by deployments. And in the middle of them, barely reaching the shoulder of the man beside her, stood Julia Kane. Her uniform clung awkwardly to her frame, sleeves rolled one time too many, trousers cinched at the belt so they wouldn't slip. Even her boots betrayed her. Issued in the smallest size available, they were still too large, the leather swallowing her ankles. Inside, she had packed layers of paper to stop them from flopping, a secret that squeaked faintly with every step. The smirks of her peers cut deeper than the heat. One candidate whispered behind his hand, another chuckled loud enough for the line to ripple. Julia kept her eyes fixed straight ahead. She had expected the laughter, prepared herself for the skepticism, but expectation did not make the sting less sharp. A door slammed open. The noise snapped the formation to attention. From the administration building strode Captain Holt, his jaw set hard, silver at his temples catching the sunlight. On either side walked Master Sergeant Rowan, weathered and stoic, and Sergeant First Class Vega, lean and coiled, his eyes scanning like a hawk searching for weakness. "Candidates!" Holt's voice rolled across the asphalt. "Welcome to Scout Sniper School!" The air seemed to tighten. "You were not sent here to be average," Holt continued. "You were sent here because record suggested you might endure what others could not. Potential means nothing unless proven. From this moment, your past deployments, your prior accolades, your personal histories are irrelevant. You will be measured only by what you accomplish here." He paced slowly down the line, boots striking like drumbeats. Each candidate stood taller as his gaze passed. Then his eyes landed on Julia. For a fraction of a second, the silence thickened. Holt's face betrayed nothing, no surprise, no disdain, just cold appraisal. But the pause stretched long enough for everyone else to notice. Julia's jaw tightened. She refused to drop her gaze. "Some of you will discover you do not belong," Holt said finally, moving on. "Others will learn that you can achieve more than you ever imagined. We will find out which you are." Rowan stepped forward. His voice was gravel, worn from decades of commands. "The battlefield requires a sniper who can strike from beyond sight, live unseen for days, carry loads that break men twice your size. It requires patience, calculation, and precision under fire. We are not here to create shooters. We are here to forge ghosts." Vega followed. His tone carried less instruction and more venom. "Make no mistake. Most of you will not finish this program. We will not lower standards. Not for politics, not for diversity, not for anyone. If you are here because some administrator thought it would make a nice experiment, you'll be gone in days." He stopped in front of Julia, eyes narrowing. "Isn't that right, Kane?" A ripple passed through the line. Some candidates grinned openly now. Julia felt the heat crawl up her neck but held herself steady. "No experiment, Sergeant," she said clearly. "I'm here to prove I belong." For the first time, Vega's lips twitched in something like amusement. "We'll see." The formation was dismissed to the quartermaster. The shuffle of boots carried them toward the equipment bay, but the sideways glances followed Julia like gnats. Inside, while packs, uniforms, and weapons were issued, the whispers sharpened. "Who let her in? She'll fold before Friday. Waste of a bunk." Julia ignored them, methodically stowing her gear into a metal trunk. A shadow fell over her. She looked up into the chest of Robert Thompson, a tall, scarred Marine with a crooked grin that never reached his eyes. "So you're the one causing all the chatter," he drawled. "Didn't think the rumors were true. A girl in sniper school." He leaned an elbow against the bunk post, towering over her. "This isn't boot camp, sweetheart. This program breaks down men who've survived combat tours. You think you're walking out of here? You're a liability." Julia kept folding her uniform, hands precise, refusing to acknowledge his bait. He tilted his head. "Nothing to say? Thought so." Another voice cut in from the doorway. "Problem here?" Michael Chen stood in the frame, slender, with the posture of someone who carried quiet strength. His voice was calm, almost polite, but the way he stepped into the room placed his body between Julia and Thompson. "No problem," Thompson said, his grin fading. "Just welcoming our new teammate." He shoved off the post and stalked away, his followers trailing. Chen glanced back at Julia. "Ignore them. They'll test anyone new, especially you." She nodded once. "I've dealt with worse." The room buzzed with orders to form up again. Sergeant Vega herded them toward the obstacle yard. The first evaluation was scheduled for dawn, but already the air crackled with rivalry. That night, the barracks carried the uneasy energy of men preparing for war. Julia sat on her bunk, hands resting on a small folded photograph tucked into her locker. Her father's broad shoulders filled the frame, one hand resting on a teenage Julia's shoulder at a firing range. The other photo, her brother Mason, in dress blues, smiling before his final deployment. She traced the edges, remembering the promises made at both graves. The lights snapped out. Murmurs dwindled to silence, broken only by the groan of bunks. Julia lay back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady breathing of 24 men who believed she would fail. Sleep came only in fragments, chased by the thought, tomorrow the proving begins. Morning arrived with a chill of sea air sweeping inland. Before sunrise, the candidates stood in running gear on the beach, waves lapping cold foam across their boots. Vega paced before them like a predator, stopwatch in hand. "This is the start," he barked. 20 kilometers, full packs, 5 hours. Fall out, you're gone. Cut weight, you're gone. This is not a jog, this is survival. Julia adjusted the straps of the rucksack, biting into her shoulders. The load was nearly a third of her body weight. Physics alone conspired against her. Yet when Vega blew the whistle, she pushed forward with the pack bouncing against her spine, sand sucking at her boots. The stronger candidates surged ahead quickly, Thompson among them, grinning over his shoulder. Julia settled into the middle, controlling her breathing, each step deliberate. Within a mile, sweat stung her eyes. By 5, the field spread wide. She pressed on, thighs burning, lungs aflame. Beside her, Chen matched pace. "Doing okay?" he asked between breaths. "Never better," she managed, though her body screamed otherwise. By the 15th kilometer, her vision blurred at the edges. She heard Vega's voice at a checkpoint, 13 minutes behind pace. "Kane, pick it up or you're finished." His words cut, but she did not respond. She leaned into the pain, narrowed her world to the next footfall, then the next. One memory surfaced, a hunting trip with her father, his voice steady as she struggled under the weight of gear. "Pain is just a message, Julia. Recognize it, then set it aside. Your mind decides when you're done." Her boots struck sand again and again until the final marker appeared. Rowan waited, stopwatch in hand. Julia stumbled the last stretch, crossed the line and collapsed to one knee. 4 hours, 52 minutes, Rowan said quietly. 8 minutes to spare. His eyes, pale and unreadable, lingered on her as she rose unsteadily to her feet. For the first time, a flicker of something that might have been respect crossed his face. She had survived the first cut. Back at the barracks, Thompson sneered as she limped past. "Enjoy it while it lasts. That's the easiest it'll get." Julia ignored him, stripping off her sweat-soaked gear. She had no illusions. The march was only the beginning. The real tests, those that would expose her as either fraud or fighter, were still to come. But tonight, with every muscle aching, she allowed herself a small truth: she was still standing. And that was enough. Dawn rolled in muted grey over the coastline, waves breaking like muffled drums on the sand. The candidates stood once again in formation, this time stripped to fatigues, sweat still drying from the march of the day before. Some wore grim determination, others exuded smug confidence, as if already imagining themselves in the next phase. Julia Kane kept her eyes forward, shoulders squared against the cold. Her body still ached from the ruck, but pain was now background noise, a constant hum she refused to let dictate her movements. Sergeant First Class Vega prowled before them, stopwatch swinging from one hand, eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Yesterday was distance," he barked. "Today is endurance." He gestured to the obstacle course sprawling across the training ground. Wooden walls loomed, cargo nets sagged under the damp air, ropes swung over muddy pits, steel frames rose like scaffolding from hell itself. The entire field seemed designed not for competition but for humiliation, a gauntlet meant to break the strongest man down to trembling limbs. 2 circuits, complete both or you're finished. Cut corners, you're finished. Show weakness and you'll be remembered. Vega's gaze swept the candidates, lingering again on Julia. A thin smile cut across his face, cold and sharp. A whistle shrieked. The line surged forward. Thompson exploded into motion, muscles straining as he vaulted the first wall. His companions followed, some scrambling, others climbing, grunts mixing with the clatter of boots on wood. Julia approached the same wall, the height of it nearly twice her reach. She leapt, fingers clawing at the edge, slipped, then tried again. The second attempt gained her enough purchase to hook a knee over, dragging herself up with grit rather than power. Mud caked her palms, her ribs slammed into the ledge, but she pushed onward, rolling over the top and dropping hard on the other side. The next challenge was the rope crawl, a suspended line stretched over a muddy trench. Men clung belly down, hauling themselves hand over hand. Julia grasped the line, body swaying as she began inching across. Her arms trembled under the weight of her pack, every muscle burning with protest. The rope twisted, threatening to flip her. Below, brown water stank of algae. "Fall, Kane!" Thompson shouted from ahead, voice mocking. "It'll save us the trouble later." She ignored him, eyes fixed on the far post. Hand over hand, thighs clamped against the rope. She slipped once, heart in her throat, then recovered, teeth clenched until her jaw ached. At last she swung down on the opposite bank, breath ragged but still moving. Through the next sequence she endured, monkey bars that blistered her palms, a balance beam slick with rain, a crawl under barbed wire where grit filled her mouth and scraped her elbows raw. Every obstacle seemed designed to expose her smaller frame, to punish her lack of brute strength. And yet, through technique, momentum, and sheer refusal to quit, she forced herself through each. By the end of the first circuit, sweat poured down her back, uniform streaked with mud, arms trembling. Many candidates looked no better. Several gasped for air, faces twisted in agony, but the eyes on Julia were different. They watched, not expecting survival, but anticipating collapse. The whistle shrieked again. "Second circuit!" Julia's lungs screamed rebellion. Her legs felt weighted with iron. Still, she forced her body forward, stumbling into the course once more. At the high wall, she nearly failed. Her first 2 attempts left her sliding down, palms bleeding. Vega's voice cut through the haze. "Quit now, Kane. Save us all the paperwork." She stood panting, staring up at the looming structure. For a moment, the world narrowed to that barrier, impossible, unyielding. A voice surfaced from memory, her father's calm certainty. "When the mountain looks too high, find another path up. There's always a way." Julia stepped back, sprinted, and drove her knee higher on the jump, hooking it onto a crack in the wood. Using momentum, she hauled herself, every tendon straining, until she rolled over the top once more. Gasps rippled from the line of observers. Vega's smirk faltered. By the rope crawl, her forearms were fire, grip faltering. She swung, nearly dropped, then clamped her thighs tighter. Below, the muddy trench seemed to laugh at her weakness. She refused to give it the satisfaction. She closed her eyes, counted breaths, and resumed. Halfway across, her hands slipped again. Her body dangled, weight tearing at her shoulders. Candidates paused to watch, some with pity, others with satisfaction. Chen, already ahead, shouted hoarsely, "Focus! Kane! Breathe!" She forced air into her lungs, reset her grip, and continued inch by inch until she collapsed on the far bank. Vega's whistle cut sharp. "Move!" The second circuit blurred into survival. Crawling, climbing, staggering, she became less a soldier than a stubborn will encased in battered flesh. Bruises blossomed on her shins, her palms split open, blood mixing with mud. Yet she endured. The final obstacle loomed, a 20-foot cargo net swaying in the wind. Candidates scrambled upward, ropes groaning under the combined weight. Julia gripped the net, body trembling as she began the climb. Halfway up, Thompson descended from above, boot pressing deliberately near her hand. "Wrong place, Kane," he sneered. "Fall now, before the net decides for you." She met his eyes, lips pressed thin, and said nothing. Slowly, deliberately, she shifted her weight to another rope, dodging his interference. Rage flared in his face, but Rowan's voice thundered from the ground. "Thompson, move! Finish the climb or be done!" Snarling, Thompson continued upward. Julia followed, every motion agony, until she reached the summit. She straddled the top bar, chest heaving, and then descended the far side hand underhand until boots struck earth once more. The whistle screamed. The course was over. Candidates sprawled on the ground, gasping, coated in filth. Some collapsed, unable to rise. Julia dropped to her knees, arms dangling, vision swimming, yet she stayed upright, refusing to lie flat. Rowan strode across the field, expression carved from stone. He looked at the battered line of survivors, then at Julia in particular. His eyes lingered, not with approval, but with something closer to curiosity. An acknowledgement that she had endured what many predicted she could not. 15 finished both circuits, he announced. 10 did not. His gaze cut across the group. The standard does not care who you are. The standard only cares if you survive it. Vega scowled, clearly unsatisfied, but Rowan's next words carried weight. "Kane, you're still here." A ripple moved through the group. Some sneered, others muttered disbelief. Chen gave a brief nod, quiet respect in his eyes. Thompson turned away, jaw tight, fury simmering. Julia said nothing. She had no breath for words. She only stood, mud dripping from her uniform, blood drying on her hands, heart thundering with exhaustion, and something else, resolve. That evening, the barracks hummed with subdued conversation. Candidates compared bruises, laughed bitterly at the cruelty of the course, cursed Vega under their breath. Julia cleaned her wounds in silence, rewrapping torn palms with gauze. She caught her reflection in the small mirror above her bunk. Eyes reddened, hair plastered with sweat, lips pale. Yet the eyes staring back were steady, unflinching. A voice broke the quiet. Chen leaned against the bunk rail, water bottle in hand. "You should have quit a dozen times today, but you didn't." Julia shrugged, binding her hand tighter. Quitting was never an option. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Most people here don't get that." Thompson passed, muttering under his breath, but Julia ignored him. The hostility no longer mattered. What mattered was that she had faced the crucible and still stood. Later that night, as lights flicked out and darkness blanketed the barracks, Julia lay awake listening to the breathing of men around her. Pain radiated from every joint, every muscle screamed with fatigue. Yet beneath the ache ran something steady, something immovable. They had thrown the first real test at her, and she had not broken. The mountain loomed higher still, challenges ahead more brutal, but she had taken the first step, and she knew now with iron certainty, no matter the obstacles, no matter the weight, she would keep climbing. The sea air tasted of salt and steel. A steady breeze swept across the shooting range carved into the bluff above the Mediterranean, whipping the pennants fixed beside the targets and filling the morning silence with their restless snapping. 20 candidates stood lined along the firing line, rifles laid out on racks behind them, the weight of expectation pressing down heavier than any rucksack. Julia Kane flexed her torn hands. The gauze she had wrapped around her palms after the obstacle course was hidden beneath thin gloves. They throbbed, raw reminders of how much she had bled to remain in the program. Every movement of her fingers sent a sting up her forearms, but she kept her expression flat. No one would see weakness. Not today. Captain Holt addressed the formation from behind the benches, his tone more formal than usual, as if this moment carried ceremonial weight. "You've marched, you've climbed, you've endured the course. None of that matters without precision. A sniper's rifle is an extension of their will. If you cannot master it, nothing else matters." He gestured to the racks. Long-barreled M485 rifles gleamed under the rising sun, matte black with heavy scopes. The bolts caught flashes of light like the teeth of a predator. Holt nodded to Rowan, who moved to the center of the line, his voice deep and unhurried. 5 rounds at each distance. 100, 200, 400, 600, and finally 800 yards. Grouping and accuracy under real wind conditions will decide your baseline scores. Fail to place your shots consistently, and you will not advance. A murmur rippled through the group. Thompson cracked his knuckles, already grinning, certain he would impress. Chen simply nodded to himself, quiet as always. Julia stood motionless, letting the details settle into her mind. Vega stalked the line with a clipboard, his smile dripping disdain. When he reached Julia, he plucked a rifle from the rack and shoved it into her arms. "This one's heavier than you are, Kane. Try not to drop it." Several candidates chuckled. Julia ignored them, accepting the weapon. It was long, awkward against her smaller frame, the stock designed for broad shoulders and longer arms. She had anticipated this mismatch. Months of private practice with oversized rifles had taught her how to adjust her stance, how to find stability despite the lack of fit. The order came to load. Julia laid prone on the mat, adjusting her elbows in the dirt, pressing her cheek to the stock. She inhaled the smell of oil and steel. The rifle felt cold and impersonal, but in her grip it became an old companion. She had been handling weapons since before algebra, guided by a father who believed precision was not a skill but a language. At the far end of the line, Thompson raised his weapon first. He fired confidently, 5 sharp cracks in quick succession. Through binoculars, Vega studied his target and nodded. Tight grouping, 10 ring. Others followed. Chen's shots rang steady, his breathing controlled, each round striking with crisp reliability. Then Vega's boots scraped closer to Julia's mat. "Whenever you're ready, Kane," he muttered, voice low enough that only she could hear. "If you can reach the trigger." She shut out his words, focused on the flags downrange, the way they twitched and snapped. She judged the breeze, noted its shift halfway across the field. She adjusted the scope, exhaled half a breath, and squeezed. The rifle kicked, steady and familiar. The casing ejected with a metallic clink. She worked the bolt, chambered the next round, and repeated the process 4 more times with calm precision. No wasted motion, no hurry. When the ceasefire was called, Rowan strode forward with binoculars. He stopped at her target and held still for a long moment. Then he walked back slowly, eyes unreadable. Walker, Thompson, Chen, 5s in the 10 ring. He paused deliberately. Kane, 5 rounds through the same hole. The silence that followed was more powerful than any cheer. Even Thompson's grin faltered. Candidates glanced at each other, murmuring disbelief. Perfect overlap at 100 yards was rare, even for seasoned shooters. For a candidate carrying bandaged hands and a mismatched rifle, it was extraordinary. Vega's jaw tightened. "Beginner's luck," he said aloud, too loud, as if trying to convince himself. 200 yards, Rowan ordered. They repositioned. Julia adjusted her stance for the longer distance. The wind stiffened. She read it carefully, made her corrections, and fired again. 5 shots, another ceasefire. Rowan inspected her target, lips pressing into a thin line, tight grouping, still perfect. By the 400-yard line, conversation had died. Every eye shifted to Julia each time she settled behind her rifle. At 600, gusts whipped hard across the bluff, scattering sand. Julia narrowed her eyes, adjusted for the gusts, and delivered 5 rounds that landed in a group smaller than a clenched fist. 800 yards was the true test. At that distance, gravity bent the bullet's path like an unseen hand, dragging it down more than 12 feet. Wind could drift it sideways by yards. Even the curvature of the earth mattered. Only a handful of candidates even managed to keep their rounds on the target. Julia studied the conditions through narrowed eyes, noting the faint shimmer of heat rising from the sand, the twitch of each flag at different intervals. She adjusted her elevation, dialed her windage, then inhaled and settled. Her finger pressed gently, finding that fragile space of stillness between her heartbeat. The crack of her shot sliced the wind. Through the scope, she watched the round arc across distance and strike exactly where she'd calculated. 4 more followed, each within a 3-inch cluster. When Rowan returned, his face betrayed the slightest flicker of astonishment before he masked it. 5 rounds, 3-inch group. The murmurs were louder now. Thompson muttered curses under his breath. Chen shot her a glance, not envy but recognition. Vega bent over her rifle, inspecting the chamber as though convinced she had altered it. "What trick are you playing, Kane?" he hissed. "No trick," she said calmly, cleaning her scope. "Just math." Rowan cut in sharply. "That's enough, Sergeant. Her results stand." The candidates cleaned their weapons in silence, but the dynamic had shifted. Where earlier Julia had been dismissed as an inevitable failure, now she was something else. An anomaly, a threat, a mark of brilliance that unsettled everyone who thought they understood the hierarchy. The afternoon brought the next phase, a classroom lit with sterile fluorescent light. Equations filled the projector screen, wind deflection formulas, angle of fire adjustments, ballistic coefficients. Candidates shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. For many, numbers blurred together into a wall of incomprehension. Julia moved her pencil quickly, calculating bullet drop, windage, humidity adjustments, the mathematics her father had drilled into her during childhood outings. For her, it was less a problem set than a familiar rhythm. Halfway through, she set her pencil down. She had finished. Chen noticed and raised an eyebrow, still working. When Holt collected the papers, he glanced at Julia's, brows arching slightly. "Finished already?" "Yes, sir." He didn't comment further, but she caught the faintest lift at the corner of his mouth, as if curiosity had replaced doubt. That evening, the candidates filed back into the barracks. Thompson glared as Julia passed, but the venom had dulled. He could no longer dismiss her outright. Chen approached her bunk as she cleaned her rifle with meticulous care. "That was more than luck," he said quietly. Julia shrugged. "I've been shooting a long time." "You don't need to explain," he replied, "but you've painted a target on yourself. People don't like surprises, especially not here." She considered his words, then nodded. "Then I'll give them more to be surprised about." Chen smiled faintly, the closest thing to camaraderie this place allowed. "Just make sure you don't surprise yourself." As lights dimmed and silence settled, Julia lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling again. The sting in her hands had not eased. The murmurs of the other candidates still carried tones of resentment and disbelief, but she had proved something undeniable. She could shoot, not just competently, but with a precision that turned disbelief into uneasy silence. And though she knew the days ahead would bring harsher trials, she allowed herself, for one breath, to feel the smallest flicker of vindication. The classroom buzzed with low voices as the candidates filed into their seats. Chalk dust clung to the corners of the blackboard, and the scent of gun oil lingered from the morning's range session. Julia Kane slid into her chair near the back, her posture calm, her face an unreadable mask. She had grown accustomed to the sidelong glances, the mix of curiosity and suspicion that followed her since her performance on the range. Captain Holt entered, trailed by Rowan and Vega. The room snapped to silence. Holt gestured to Rowan, who began a lecture on counter-sniper tactics. He spoke with the dry precision of a man who had lived these lessons in hostile valleys and on rooftops across war zones. An enemy marksman, Rowan intoned, does not merely target individuals, they target morale. A single well-placed shot can paralyze a unit, sow confusion, and grind an operation to a halt. Your task is not only to outshoot them, but to outthink them, anticipate where they will be, deny them angles, force them into mistakes. The projector hummed to life, casting grainy images of conflict zones, broken walls, crumbling buildings, ridges where enemy snipers had once hidden. The candidates scribbled notes, eyes flicking to the screen. Julia wrote steadily, absorbing every detail. Then, halfway through the lesson, a hand rose. Robert Thompson leaned back in his chair, voice dripping with false innocence. "Master Sergeant," he began, "how important is prior knowledge in countering enemy snipers? Say, if a candidate had family members who were experts in the field, wouldn't that give them an unfair advantage?" The room froze. Every eye turned toward him. His smirk widened as he reached into his pack and produced a thin manila folder. Rowan's voice dropped, low and dangerous. "Where did you get that, Thompson?" "It was left out," Thompson said casually, holding it up so the whole class could see the label. Kane, Julia. "And it makes for very interesting reading." Julia's stomach turned cold. Thompson flipped the folder open with theatrical flair. "Let's see." Father, Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Kane, one of the most decorated snipers in modern military history. Brother, Lieutenant Mason Kane, Navy SEAL, killed in Afghanistan. And here she is, walking the same path. Doesn't anyone else think it's odd she never mentioned any of this? A stunned silence spread across the room, heavy and suffocating. Then whispers erupted. Shock, recognition, envy, contempt. "She's a Kane? Why didn't she say?" "Explains the shooting." Julia sat motionless, every muscle locked, refusing to give Thompson the satisfaction of a reaction. Rowan strode forward, snatching the file from Thompson's hands with such force the papers nearly tore. His eyes narrowed. "You accessed confidential personnel information. That is a serious breach." Thompson's confidence faltered, but he recovered quickly. "I just picked it up. It was lying on Sergeant Vega's desk when I reported for extra duty. Can't fault me for noticing what was right in front of me." The words hung in the air like poison. Vega stiffened, but his expression remained unreadable. "Enough!" Holt barked. His voice cracked across the room like a rifle shot. "Thompson, my office, now!" Thompson rose slowly, his earlier bravado thinning. He shot Julia one last smug glance before leaving with Holt. The classroom remained tense. Rowan addressed the others. 10-minute break. Outside. Now. The candidates filed out, murmuring louder now that discipline had loosened. Julia stayed seated, eyes fixed on the grain of the desk, waiting. When the room was empty, Rowan turned to her. "Is it true?" "Yes, Master Sergeant," Julia said evenly. "Why didn't you disclose it?" "Because it doesn't change what I have to prove," she replied, meeting his gaze. "I didn't want to be judged as my father's daughter or my brother's shadow, only by what I do here." Rowan studied her for a long moment. The hardness in his face softened slightly, though his voice remained stern. "Understand this, the Kane name carries weight. Some will see it as privilege. Others will see it as a standard you can never meet. Either way, it will not make your path easier." "I know." Rowan nodded slowly. "Then carry it carefully. Your father was a legend, but legends cast long shadows. And your brother?" He hesitated. "He died serving. That matters." Julia inclined her head, her voice controlled, though her chest tightened at the mention. "It matters to me most of all." That night the barracks churned with speculation. Some candidates gave Julia a wider berth, as if proximity to her carried unspoken pressure. Others eyed her with thinly veiled resentment, muttering accusations of favoritism. "You think she got in on merit?" one scoffed. "Her father's name got her here. She doesn't deserve it." Julia sat on her bunk, methodically cleaning her rifle. She moved slowly, each stroke deliberate, refusing to acknowledge the whispers. Across the aisle, Chen approached, lowering his voice. "So it's true," he said. "Yes," Julia replied, not looking up. "That explains a lot." "Does it change anything?" she asked. Chen considered. "It changes expectations, and expectations can be heavier than any pack." She met his eyes then. "I'm not here to live anyone else's story, only my own." Chen nodded once as though that answer was enough. 2 days later, Thompson returned to training. His swagger was muted, replaced with the tight-lipped bitterness of a man carrying punishment. Rumor spread he had been formally reprimanded, assigned extra duties, stripped of privileges. Yet his glares toward Julia only sharpened, his resentment deeper than before. During a land navigation exercise, Julia and Chen passed Thompson and Ramirez struggling with coordinates. A folder peeked from Thompson's rucksack again, her folder. Her name visible in bold letters. Her stomach dropped. He hadn't let it go. When she caught Chen's eye, he nodded toward the folder, lips tightening. Later, away from Thompson, he whispered, "He'll use it again, one way or another." Julia felt the truth of it in her bones. The revelation hadn't been a one-time blow. It was a wound that would fester, fuel for every whisper of doubt, every sneer. She would be forced to fight not just the course itself, but the shadow of her own bloodline. That evening, Rowan called her aside after training. His weathered face carried less severity than usual, though his voice was deliberate. "I knew your father," he said quietly, briefly, "in Desert Storm. He put 3 rounds through the same hole at 800 meters with iron sights. When people called him gifted, he told them it wasn't his eyes or his hands, it was patience. Said a sniper's greatest weapon is patience." Julia swallowed hard, her throat tight. "Your father earned respect through results, not reputation," Rowan continued. "If you want to survive this program, you must do the same. Don't lean on his legacy. Build your own." She nodded, the words resonating with the weight of truth. "Good," Rowan said, "because whether you like it or not, everyone now expects you to fail, or to be better than anyone else alive. Either way, the only way forward is through performance." That night, alone in the barracks while others slept, Julia pulled the photographs from her locker again. Her father's steady gaze, her brother's confident smile. She held them both, silent, remembering the promises she had made at gravesides in whispered vows that she would carry their memory forward. But now that vow had been dragged into the open, weaponized by men who saw it as weakness. She slid the photos back, closed the locker, and sat on her bunk in the dark. The room was silent except for the breathing of exhausted men. The Kane name was no longer her secret. It was a burden made public, a standard sharpened into a blade, and she knew with icy certainty, from here on, every step, every breath, every shot would be measured against it. She would not hide anymore. But she would not falter either. The mountains rose sharp and unforgiving against a pale horizon, ridgelines cutting the sky into jagged teeth. The candidates were dropped by convoy at dawn, dust swirling from the departing vehicles, the smell of diesel fading into crisp alpine air. Each carried a pack heavy with rations, gear, and blank rounds, though the weight of expectation pressed heavier than the supplies. Rowan stood before them, clipboard tucked under one arm, his expression carved from stone. 72 hours. He said, voice carrying across the plateau. You will move undetected through this terrain, establish observation, report enemy activity, and extract without compromise. Fail to remain unseen, fail to complete objectives, or fail to return. Your training ends. Vega paced behind him like a wolf on a leash. And remember, this is not a game. You'll be hunted. You'll be hungry, exhausted, and cold. That's deliberate. Real enemies won't care if you're tired. The assignments were read out. Julia found her name paired with Chen. Thompson smirked when his own partner was called, shooting her a look that promised trouble. Julia and Chen exchanged a brief nod before slipping into the trees. The mountains swallowed them quickly, silence closing in. Hours into the first day, they navigated steep gullies and clambered over loose rock. Chen moved methodically, compass steady in his hand, eyes scanning for landmarks. Julia trailed half a step behind, observing the terrain with the sniper's instinct her father had drilled into her. Angles, cover, sightlines. At midday, they located a ridge overlooking a valley where instructors had staged enemy patrols, role players in fatigues, carrying rifles loaded with blanks. Julia settled behind her scope, tracking their movement. She whispered numbers to Chen, range, bearing, estimated time of patrols. He jotted notes, careful and precise. By evening, the wind sharpened and the temperature dropped. They sheltered beneath a jutting rock, chewing dry rations and sharing silence broken only by the rustle of wrappers. Chen glanced over as Julia adjusted her scope again. You don't sleep much, do you? He asked quietly. Not when I'm working, she said. You're always working. Her mouth twitched, not quite a smile. That's why I'm here. He nodded, letting it drop. The second night brought rain, cold needles that soaked their uniforms and turned paths into slick channels of mud. Julia pulled her poncho tighter, teeth clenched against the chill. Chen pressed on without complaint, though she caught the tremor in his hands as they set up a hide overlooking the valley floor. Near dawn, disaster struck. Julia had her eye pressed to the scope when shadows moved below. An enemy patrol, more numerous than before. They fanned out in a sweep pattern, converging on the slope where she and Chen lay concealed. She hissed a warning, but it was too late. A branch cracked under Chen's boot, the sound snapping across the night like a gunshot. Shouts rang out, flashlights slashed upward, beams stabbing through the rain. Go! Julia urged, grabbing his arm. They scrambled higher, mud dragging at their boots, lungs burning. But the patrol was quicker than she anticipated. Within moments, Chen was seized, dragged down the slope by two role players acting as enemy captors. Julia dove into cover, heart pounding, watching through the veil of rain as Chen was hauled away. His voice shouted back, raw and desperate, "Keep going! Complete the mission!" The words echoed what every candidate had been told since arrival. Never jeopardize the mission for a teammate in simulation. The doctrine was clear. Abandon him, stay hidden, continue the assignment. Her hands trembled against the rifle. Doctrine screamed one command, loyalty whispered another. For several minutes she lay frozen, mud soaking through her uniform, the rain drumming mercilessly. The patrol disappeared into the valley, Chen's silhouette vanishing between the trees. Julia exhaled, long and sharp. She made her choice. Moving low and silent, she tailed the patrol from the ridgeline, keeping their lights in sight, but staying beyond detection. Her boots slid on wet stone, her breath steaming in the cold. Every muscle screamed protest, yet she pressed on, mind racing with calculations. She found them at a clearing where a temporary camp had been staged. Chen sat bound near the fire, 2 guards posted. The rest lounged beneath tarps, rifles leaning against logs. Julia belly-crawled through mud until she reached the tree line. She studied their positions, rehearsing each move in her head. Distract, isolate, strike. The rules of the exercise forbade live rounds, but stealth and strategy were fair game. She removed a small rock from her pocket, pitched it into the darkness opposite her position. It clattered against stone. 1 guard stiffened, flashlight sweeping toward the noise. Julia slid behind him in the confusion, pressing her training rifle's cold barrel against his back. "Tagged," she whispered. Startled, he raised his hands in surrender, simulation rules declaring him eliminated. Julia shoved him aside, grabbed his flashlight, and killed it. The second guard turned, confused. Julia lunged, sweeping his legs with a low kick. He fell, cursing, and she drove the butt of her rifle against his chest, another elimination. Heart hammering, she cut Chen's bindings. His eyes widened. "You're insane," he hissed. "Can you move?" she asked. He flexed his wrists, nodding. "Yes." "Then follow me." They melted back into the trees, the camp erupting behind them as the remaining enemies discovered the breach. Shouts and whistles cut through the rain, beams slicing through the forest. Julia led Chen through gullies and over rocks, using every ounce of terrain knowledge drilled into her childhood. They stumbled, slipped, clawed their way upward until the shouts faded behind them. At last, breathless and drenched, they collapsed beneath an overhang. Julia scanned the valley below, rifle steady, until she was sure they had shaken pursuit. Chen's chest heaved with ragged laughter. "You just broke every rule in the book." Julia's lips pressed into a thin line. "Better than breaking you." He sobered, studying her through the gloom. "They're going to crucify you for this." "Maybe," she admitted, "but at least you're here to see it." By dawn, they regrouped with the rest of the candidates at the extraction point. Vega's eyes burned with fury as he counted them off, stopping on Julia and Chen. "You abandoned mission protocol," he snapped. "You jeopardized the exercise to save a captured asset. That is a failure." Rowan, standing beside him, studied Julia silently. He said nothing, just scribbled on his clipboard. The convoy rumbled back to base. Inside the barracks, whispers already spread like fire. Some called her reckless, others quietly admired her defiance. That evening, Holt summoned her to his office. The room smelled of leather and paper, blinds drawn against the sinking sun. Holt sat behind his desk, Rowan standing at his shoulder, Vega pacing like a restless animal. "You understand what you did?" Holt began. "Yes, sir," Julia replied. "Explain it." "My orders were to complete the mission," she said. "But missions change, conditions change. In the field, abandoning a partner can mean the loss of the entire team. I judged that the greater risk was leaving him behind." Vega slammed his fist against the desk. "Excuses. Doctrine is clear." Rowan's voice cut in, calm but firm. "Doctrine is a framework. Real combat is chaos." She broke rules, yes, but she also adapted and succeeded. Silence stretched. Holt's eyes bored into Julia's. Then, slowly, he leaned back. "Your decision was unorthodox," he said at last, "but sometimes Unorthodox keeps men alive. You'll continue in the program, but understand, every step from here will be under sharper scrutiny." Julia saluted, pulse pounding, and withdrew. Outside, Chen waited. "Well?" he asked. "I'm still here," she said simply. He grinned. "Good. Because I'd rather have you beside me than anyone else." For the first time in weeks, Julia felt the smallest crack in the wall around her resolve. Not comfort, not ease, just the flicker of trust earned in fire. That night, as rain tapped against the barracks roof, she lay awake, staring at the shadows above her bunk. The memory of the pursuit replayed: mud, breath, the snap of ropes as she cut Chen free. It wasn't triumph that lingered, but the weight of choice. She knew Vega would watch her with sharper knives. She knew Thompson would twist the story into ammunition. But she also knew this: when faced with the decision to walk away or to risk everything for a comrade, she had chosen the harder path, and deep down she would make that choice again. The Pyrenees loomed like a fortress of jagged white. Wind screamed across the ridgelines, carrying shards of ice that cut at exposed skin. Snow whipped sideways, a curtain so thick it erased the horizon. The candidates had been dropped on the lower slope with orders simple in wording, brutal in execution: survive 48 hours, remain hidden, and transmit hourly reports. By the first night the storm arrived. Julia and Chen huddled beneath a shallow overhang, ponchos useless against the gale. Their radios crackled with static, voices lost in the roar of wind. Breath froze in clouds that hung like ghosts in the frigid air. Chen shivered uncontrollably, teeth clattering. His lips had turned a shade of blue, his eyes glassy. "Fine," he muttered, voice shaking. "I'm fine." "You're not," Julia said. She stripped off her outer jacket and wrapped it around him, ignoring his weak protests. The cold punched through her thin layers, biting at her ribs, but she pressed close, sharing warmth the way her father once taught her during a winter hunt. She lit a chemical heat pack and tucked it against his chest. "Stay awake," she ordered. "Talk to me." Chen forced a laugh that came out more like a cough. "You really don't follow rules, do you?" "Not when they're written by men who've never faced this cold," she said, rubbing circulation back into his arms. Hours dragged. The storm battered their shelter, snow piling against their boots. Julia forced herself to keep moving, massaging Chen's hands, shifting positions, checking their gear. Fatigue clawed at her, urging her to close her eyes, but she knew sleep meant death. At dawn, the storm eased to a vicious wind. Julia crawled out, scouted the ridge, and found a narrow cave half buried by drifts. She dragged Chen inside, propped him against the stone, and worked quickly, layering dry socks from her own pack onto his feet, melting snow in her canteen cap for water, rationing out their remaining food. "Why?" Chen whispered, voice faint. "Because I need you standing when this is over," Julia answered. "And because leaving you isn't an option." His eyes closed, but his breathing steadied. For the next day, Julia kept a fireless vigil, marking reports in her notebook, transmitting when static allowed, watching Chen's chest rise and fall. Her own hands shook with cold, skin raw and cracked, but her resolve burned hotter than the storm. When extraction finally came, she half-carried, half-dragged Chen down the slope to the rally point. Instructors met them with critical eyes, recording every detail. Vega sneered, muttering about recklessness, but Rowan simply noted the facts. 2 candidates alive, reports complete, mission fulfilled. That night in the barracks, Chen caught her wrist, his grip weak, but his gaze steady. "You saved me." Julia shook her head. "We saved each other." Outside, the wind still howled, but inside something stronger had been forged, a bond sealed in snow and survival, and a reputation that even her enemies could no longer dismiss. The storm had passed, but the mountain still bore its scars. Drifts of snow clung to the valleys like frozen waves, and the air carried the sharp bite of cold that seeped into lungs. The candidates assembled once more on the range, carved into a mountain plateau, rifles in hand, eyes hollow with fatigue. This was the culmination. Weeks of punishing drills, endless calculations, bruises, and doubt had led to this. The long-distance marksmanship evaluation. Fail here and nothing else mattered. Captain Holt stood before them, posture iron straight, his breath misted in the cold. You've endured the marches, the storms, the exercises. All of it leads to this. One shot can change the outcome of a mission. Today you will prove whether you can deliver that shot. Rowan pointed downrange. Steel silhouettes stood staggered across the frozen expanse, the farthest nearly invisible against the snow at 850 meters. Wind gusted across the plateau, scattering powder in flurries, distorting the air in shimmering waves. Targets at 400, 600 and 850, Rowan said. You will fire in sequence. Accuracy and grouping will decide if you continue. Remember, conditions are not ideal. They never are. The line settled into position. Rifles pressed to shoulders, scopes adjusted, fingers poised. Vega prowled like a vulture, eager for weakness. Julia lay prone at her mat, adjusting her scope with careful precision. Her bandaged hands throbbed, but she pushed the pain aside. The memory of the Pyrenees clung to her, Chen's shivering form, her own body on the brink of collapse, but it also strengthened her resolve. If she could survive that storm, she could survive this. The first commands came. Fire at 400. Thompson went first, shots ringing clean. His grouping was tight, though not perfect. Chen followed, slower, deliberate, every round finding steel. Julia inhaled, aligning crosshairs on the distant silhouette. The wind tugged left to right, she adjusted, heartbeats ticking loud in her ears. She squeezed the trigger. The crack split the air. A moment later, the steel sang with impact. She fired again and again, 5 rounds in total. Rowan checked her target through binoculars. 5 hits, consistent. The relief was fleeting. 600 came the order. The wind stiffened, cutting across the plateau with teeth. Snow stung her face as Julia steadied her rifle. The flags along the range jerked violently, pointing in shifting directions. She narrowed her eyes, recalling her father's words. Patience is your greatest weapon. The shot waits for you, not the other way around. She waited, breathing, shallow, counting seconds, watching the flags. When the gust dipped, she fired. Impact rang out just off center. The next 4 landed tighter, forming a respectable cluster. Rowan called acceptable grouping, but the real test remained. 850. The range fell silent. Even Thompson's bravado dimmed as the final challenge loomed. At that distance, every factor mattered. Air pressure, temperature, even the rise of heat from the snow. Few had ever placed a perfect cluster here. Julia pressed her cheek against the stock. The target was a blur through the scope, shimmering in the cold haze. She dialed elevation, compensated for bullet drop, recalculated wind deflection. Her mind ran through equations faster than instinct, layering math atop instinct until both became one. She exhaled, fired, the crack echoed. Through her scope she saw the round strike, but wide. Snow puffed harmlessly near the target. Murmurs rippled across the line. Vega's grin was instant, vicious. I told you, fluke. Julia ignored him, forcing calm into her chest. She rechecked her dope, adjusted again, tightened her grip. The wind gusted harder, mocking her. Sweat gathered at her temple despite the cold. She closed her eyes briefly, remembering her father's voice. Don't chase the bullet. Chase the rhythm. Wait for stillness. Trust yourself. Her eyes opened, sharper than before. She waited. Counted the lull between gusts. Pressed the trigger with surgical control. The steel sang. A perfect hit. Another shot, another hit, nearly overlapping. Then 3 more, each landing within inches of the last. Rowan lowered his binoculars slowly, face unreadable, 3-inch group at 850. Silence fell, heavier than applause. Thompson muttered a curse under his breath. Chen exhaled in quiet relief. Even Holt allowed a flicker of surprise to pass across his features. Vega snarled, but his voice faltered. Beginner's luck doesn't last that long. Rowan cut him off. Results don't lie, Sergeant. Julia cleared her rifle with steady hands. Though her heart hammered against her ribs, she had stumbled, nearly failed. But she had recovered, adjusted, delivered. Later that day, the candidates gathered for debrief in the frigid barracks. Their faces carried exhaustion, but every glance toward Julia held a new weight. She was no longer merely the outsider, the small woman mocked as weak. She was something else now, an undeniable presence, a competitor they could neither dismiss nor ignore. Thompson avoided her eyes, though his jaw remained clenched with resentment. Chen offered her a brief nod across the room, quiet affirmation. Julia sat on her bunk, cleaning her rifle, hands moving in measured rhythm. She thought of the near miss, the sting of failure, and the surge of clarity that had followed. She thought of her brother, Mason, who had once written in a letter that the hardest battles were never on the battlefield but within. She whispered to herself, barely audible, still standing. That night, Captain Holt stood outside the instructor's office with Rowan and Vega, their voices carried in the cold hallway. "She recovered," Rowan said simply. "That matters more than perfection." Holt nodded. "A sniper who cannot adapt is already dead." "She adapted," Vega spat to the side. "She's a liability. This isn't a charity." Rowan's tone sharpened. "She just outshot half the class at 850. That's not charity, that's skill." Holt's voice ended the argument. "Results stand. She advances." Inside the barracks, Julia sat awake long after lights out, rifle cradled across her lap. Outside, the wind howled through the mountains. Inside, silence pressed heavy. The Kane name had been a burden. The storm had tested her. The field had demanded sacrifice. But today, in the icy air of the plateau, she had proven something undeniable. When the moment came, when failure loomed, she could find her center and deliver the shot that mattered. And somewhere deep within, beneath exhaustion and bruises, pride stirred. Not arrogance, not triumph, just the quiet certainty that she belonged. Graduation arrived without ceremony. There were no cheering crowds, no medals pinned to chests, just 10 candidates lined in formation on a windswept field, the final survivors of 25 who had begun. Faces hollowed by hunger, uniforms frayed, eyes carrying the weight of nights without sleep. Captain Holt stepped forward, expression as unreadable as ever. "You have endured, you have adapted, you are snipers." The words hung in the air like a benediction. For Julia Kane, they carried more gravity than any oath she had spoken before. She stood at attention, uniform still damp from the mountain snow, her boots scuffed and worn, but her spine unyielding. She had made it. Against every sneer, every whisper, every doubt, she had made it. Beside her, Chen allowed himself the faintest smile, pride tempered by exhaustion. Thompson, still among the 10, kept his gaze straight ahead, though the tension in his jaw revealed his bitterness. The instructors moved down the line, handing each graduate a patch, simple, subdued, embroidered with a scope's crosshair. When Rowan placed one in Julia's palm, his eyes met hers for the briefest moment. "Your father would have understood," he said softly. "Patience, precision, persistence. You've earned it." She closed her fist around the patch, heart pounding. Deployment orders arrived within days. There was no rest, no pause to bask in accomplishment. Julia found herself boarding a transport plane bound for Central Asia, gear strapped tight, rifle packed. The mountains awaiting her there were harsher than any training ground, the valleys carved with scars of conflict. Her unit specialized in counter-sniper operations, quiet, thankless missions where failure meant comrades never returning. She moved with squads but operated at the margins, always apart, always unseen. They called her Phantom Sight. At first, the name was whispered only in radio chatter, a code name, a placeholder. But soon it grew. Stories spread through units on the ground, the unseen marksman who cut enemy fire from impossible ranges, the shadow who saved patrols without revealing her face. Julia carried the name like armor. She let it shield her from questions, from recognition. She did not correct anyone who assumed Phantom Sight was just another faceless operator. But she remembered every face she had saved. Weeks into deployment, her platoon was tasked with escorting a SEAL team through a contested valley. The mission began with routine efficiency, columns moving in staggered formation, radios crackling with updates. But by late afternoon, echoes of gunfire rolled down from the cliffs. The SEALs took cover, pinned between walls of rock. Muzzle flashes flared from ridgelines above, cutting off escape. Bullets snapped against stone, showering them with fragments. Julia pressed against the dirt, her rifle steady, eyes narrowing behind the scope. She scanned the cliff face, searching. Movement flickered. An enemy sniper shifting behind a slab of rock, preparing to fire again. She adjusted for wind, squeezed, fired. The figure crumpled. Another silhouette rose. She fired again, each shot precise, surgical, unhurried despite the chaos. "Who the hell is covering us?" a SEAL shouted over the radio. Phantom Sight, Richards, their commander, answered grimly. "Keep moving! She's clearing the way." Julia heard his words but did not respond. Her focus was total, the world narrowed to crosshairs and angles, wind and breath. A sudden crash of stone, her perch shifted under her as loose shale broke free. For an instant, she slid dangerously close to the cliff's edge, heart jolting. But she caught herself, reset her rifle, and fired again before the enemy even noticed her stumble. The SEALs broke through the kill zone, sprinting toward cover. Julia exhaled slowly, lowering her rifle only when the last man disappeared into safety. After the firefight, Richard sought her out. His uniform was streaked with dust, his face cut with fatigue, but his eyes burned with gratitude. "You saved us," he said simply, "whoever you are." Julia only nodded. She offered no name, no explanation, just silence. Richard studied her, then said, "Phantom Sight fits. You're not there, and then you are, and then the danger's gone." She said nothing, shouldering her rifle, vanishing into the rocks once more. In the weeks that followed, the legend grew. Reports came in from across the theater, patrols rescued by a single unseen sniper, ambushes broken by shots from impossible ranges. Some swore Phantom Sight was a myth, a morale tale spun to give hope. Others claimed they had seen her silhouette, a slight figure vanishing into mist. Julia ignored the stories. She focused on her work, calculating ranges, adjusting scopes, steadying her hands. Yet in quiet moments, she pulled Mason's photo from her pack, tracing the lines of his face. She thought of the man who had taken him, the sniper known as Crescent Moon. Intelligence whispered he was still active in the region, still hunting American forces. Julia vowed silently, "One day I'll find him." The chance came sooner than expected. A convoy moving through a canyon was struck by fire from high ridges. Among the chaos, intelligence confirmed the shooter's signature, Crescent Moon himself. Julia set up on an opposite slope, the canyon yawning between them. The range was extreme, far beyond the comfortable limits of most rifles. The wind howled through the channel, swirling unpredictably. Through her scope, she caught glimpses, a figure cloaked in desert colors, rifle gleaming, movements confident. This was no novice. This was the man who had ended Mason's life. Her hands tightened on the rifle. Memories surged. Her brother's smile, the folded flag at his funeral, the whispers that she would never live up to his sacrifice. She steadied herself, not with anger, not with grief, with patience. She tracked the wind, recalculated, adjusted elevation. She exhaled, fired. The shot echoed like a hammer against the canyon walls. The figure staggered, weapon clattering against rock, then disappeared from sight. The radio erupted with cheers. Crescent Moon had fallen. The threat that had haunted so many was gone. Julia lowered her rifle, her breath sharp, her hands trembling not from cold, but from the weight of it all. She whispered to the wind, words no one else could hear for Mason. Back at base, Holt read the after-action report. Expression unreadable. Phantom's sight neutralized the hostile sniper known as Crescent Moon. Mission success. Rowan glanced up. Does she know what she's become? Holt shook his head. Doesn't matter. Legends aren't built on recognition, they're built on results. Weeks later, in another valley, another unit came under fire. Bullets tore the air, men screamed into radios, panic rising, and once again, shots rang out from nowhere, cutting danger down before it could claim more lives. The soldiers looked at one another, relief mixing with awe. Phantom sight, someone whispered. On a quiet night after the mission, Julia sat alone, rifle across her knees, staring at the stars wheeling above the mountains. Her hands ached, her body bore scars, her heart carried the weight of names and memories. But she had become what no one believed possible, the small woman who was dismissed, mocked, underestimated. Now, the unseen guardian whose bullets rewrote outcomes. She whispered into the darkness, not to anyone present, but to those who lived only in memory. I belong here. And the mountains answered only with silence, holding her secret close as the legend of Phantom Sight continued to grow. Julia Kane's story doesn't end on the battlefield. It lives on in whispers, in reports stamped classified, in the quiet relief of soldiers who made it home because somewhere, on some forgotten ridge, Phantom Sight was watching over them. She never asked for glory, she never asked for recognition, and maybe that's why her legend resonates so deeply. Because it's not about medals or headlines, it's about grit, sacrifice, and the courage to keep going when everyone tells you to quit. From the first day on the parade ground, mocked for her size, doubted at every turn, to the freezing night in the Pyrenees, to that final shot against Crescent Moon, Julia proved something timeless. Greatness is not reserved for those who look the part, it belongs to those who refuse to surrender. As you've seen, too small was never a weakness. It was fuel. It was the spark that forged a sniper who rewrote the rules, who carried her brother's memory and her father's lessons, and turned doubt into firepower. Phantom Sight became more than a code name. It became a promise that unseen, uncelebrated heroes still shaped the course of battles. And now, I want to hear from you. What did Julia's journey mean to you? What moment struck hardest? The storm in the mountains, the impossible shot on the plateau, or the final reckoning in the canyon? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one, and I'd love to know where you're watching from. If you felt the tension, the heart, and the grit in this story, don't forget to subscribe to VeteranBiker. It's the best way to make sure you don't miss the next mission, the next legend, the next story that needs to be told. Hit the like button if Julia inspired you, and share this with someone who needs to hear that being underestimated can be the beginning of greatness. Thank you for riding with me through Julia Kane's journey, and stick around, because on your screen right now you'll see other stories of resilience, of warriors who defied every odd. Click 1, keep watching, and stay with VeteranBiker as we uncover the legends that history almost forgot.